Sometimes life feels like a cruel storm, pushing a person into corners where hope barely flickers, where choices shrink to almost nothing, and where the simplest acts, like buying a cup of coffee, carry the weight of a world. Tonight, in a little corner of the city, a young woman named Clara stood trembling inside a bustling cafe, clutching her worn-out purse with shaking fingers. She only had $5 left to her name, the last fragile bill that stood between her and absolute emptiness. And yet, she whispered a prayer as she slid it across the counter, buying herself not just a drink, but the tiniest shred of dignity. What she didn't know was that destiny had seated her blind date at the far end of that cafe, a man who wasn't just another customer, but the very CEO who owned the place she had just spent her last dollar in. A meeting of worlds so far apart that neither could have imagined how their night would change everything. If you believe in kindness, in second chances, and in the mysterious ways life brings people together, then please pause for a second, like this video, comment your thoughts, share it with someone who needs hope, and subscribe to Story Nest. Because stories like this remind us that miracles sometimes hide inside ordinary moments. Clara had been working as a nurse for 4 exhausting years. Every day she poured her soul into caring for strangers, patients who cried out in pain, families who begged for miracles, children who clung to her hand as though her touch alone could take away their fear. But behind her gentle smile, Clara's own life was unraveling. Her father had died unexpectedly 2 years earlier, leaving behind debts that swallowed whatever she earned. Her mother's health was failing, requiring expensive treatments that drained her savings month after month. The apartment she rented was little more than a cramped box, the kind of place where silence felt heavy and loneliness clung to every corner. She lived paycheck to paycheck, and yet, no matter how hard she worked, there was never enough left at the end of the month. That evening, Clara had finished a grueling 12-hour shift at the hospital. Her body ached, her feet burned, and her heart felt heavier than usual. A colleague had set her up on a blind date, insisting she needed something, anything, to break the endless cycle of work and worry. Clara hadn't wanted to go, but something inside whispered that maybe, just maybe, this was the universe's way of throwing her a rope. The trouble was, she didn't even have enough money to feel like she belonged in a cafe. As she counted the last crumpled $5 bill in her purse, shame prickled her skin. That was it. All she had. If the men didn't show up, she would be sitting there with nothing but a cheap drink and no way home. But still, she went. Because sometimes hope is louder than fear. The cafe was alive with the hum of conversation, the smell of roasted coffee beans wrapping around her like a blanket, though she felt anything but warm inside. She ordered the smallest drink she could afford, holding onto the paper cup as though it was a shield against the truth of her circumstances. Her dress was simple, clean, but not new. Her hair was pulled back neatly, though she'd cut it herself weeks ago to save money. She sat at a corner table, glancing nervously toward the door every few seconds. At the far end of the cafe, a man in his 30s sat with his phone in hand, his expression unreadable. His name was Adrian Cole. Most people in the city knew him as a success story, an entrepreneur who had started with nothing and built a chain of cafes that had become a household name. But Adrian was tired of people seeing him as a bank account or a stepping stone. He longed for authenticity, for someone who would look at him and see not money, not power, but a man with his own scars, his own loneliness. Tonight, he had agreed to a blind date too, skeptical but curious. When his eyes landed on Clara, sitting alone, cradling her drink like it was the most precious thing she owned, something in his chest shifted. But Clara didn't know who he was. To her, he was just a stranger she had been set up to meet. She worried he might notice her cheap outfit, the way her hands shook when she lifted the cup. She worried he'd see through her thin veil of confidence to the poverty she carried like an invisible shadow. What she didn't know was that Adrian noticed everything, and what struck him most wasn't her flaws, but the quiet dignity in her eyes, the way she carried herself despite the weight she bore. The night unfolded slowly. Clara spoke about her work, about her patience, her exhaustion, and the little moments of joy she clung to, the smile of a child after a successful surgery, the thank you from an elderly woman who had no family left. She didn't speak of her debts or her struggles. She didn't tell him this date was paid for with her very last $5. Adrian listened intently, asking gentle questions, his respect for her deepening with every word. He told her little about himself, not out of secrecy, but because he didn't want his wealth to cast a shadow over the evening. For once, he wanted to be seen simply as Adrian. As the cafe buzzed around them, Clara felt herself relax for the first time in months. His presence was calming, his attention steady. Yet deep inside, she braced herself for disappointment, certain that when the night ended, he would walk away like everyone else had. She was used to being overlooked, used to being the woman who gave everything and received little in return. When the bill came, panic rose in Clara's chest. She knew she couldn't afford anything more. But before she could even reach for her purse, Adrian quietly settled it. She thanked him, her voice tight with both relief and embarrassment. He smiled as though it was nothing, but to Clara, it was everything. The night ended, but something lingered. Over the next weeks, Adrian and Clara met again and again. Each time, Adrian saw more of the strength she tried to hide, the compassion that poured from her every word. Each time, Clara wrestled with guilt, wondering how long she could keep her reality hidden. She didn't know who he truly was, but she knew he came from a different world, a world she could never afford to enter. One evening, when her mother's health took a sudden turn for the worse, Clara broke down in Adrian's presence. She confessed the truth about her debts, her exhaustion, her fears of losing everything. She told him about the night of their first meeting, how she had spent her last $5 on that one small drink, too ashamed to admit she had nothing left. Tears streamed down her face as she waited for him to judge her, to walk away. But Adrian didn't. Instead, he reached across the table, taking her trembling hands in his. And then, gently, he revealed his truth. That he was not just another man she had met by chance, but the CEO of the very cafe chain where they had first crossed paths. Clara was stunned, unable to process the weight of his words. Shame threatened to consume her, but Adrian's eyes were steady, filled not with pity, but admiration. He told her that her courage, her resilience, and her kindness meant more to him than any fortune ever could. From that moment, their bond deepened into something unshakable. Adrian used his resources not to rescue her, but to walk beside her, to support her mother's care, to help lift the burden that had been crushing her for years. Clara, in turn, reminded Adrian of the simple, human truths that wealth could never buy: empathy, humility, and the quiet strength of a heart that refuses to give up. And so, the story of a poor nurse and a cafe CEO became a story of love born not out of wealth or status, but out of shared humanity, out of the beauty of two souls recognizing each other in a crowded world. If this story touched your heart, please take a moment to like the video, share it with someone who believes in miracles, and subscribe to Story Nest. Your support helps us bring more inspiring stories to life. Before you go, I have a special request. Comment below with the words, "Kindness changes lives," if you believe that even the smallest act of compassion can change someone's entire world. Because sometimes, a single cup of coffee, bought with the last $5, can open the door to a love and a future that no one saw coming.